So sometimes reaction content might be necessary because we're talking about freedom and we're talking about the action toward freedom. And of course, I'm going to talk about it because I think there are required steps to attaining that freedom. And there's a lot of groups out there and a lot of organizations, movements, what have you, that are trying to achieve it. Their intentions might be in the right place, but what are they doing to actually achieve freedom? So here's an example of one that is going on at the moment, through which I make this video. And it's called the global walkout. Now, first of all, if you are to look up the global walkout, you're likely to get a bunch of other results and a bunch of other walkouts that have happened before, especially even just in the past year or two. So there's been walkouts before. Where has it led? Has it really helped anything? Maybe some people got together, but is it really helpful for us? So I want to look into this. It says a unified pushback against a globalist agenda. One step at a time, hand in hand, we will walk out of the society they are trying to enslave us. They trying to enslave us. Well, I wrote a book about slavery, okay, which a lot of people can't define in the first place, by the way, and that's why it's over there, so people can define what it is so they can actually attain their freedom. That's the first thing to know. Also, they're saying they, as if we aren't the people who make society. They say in the video, because I saw some parts of it, they say that we are the power. Well, if we're the power, then why are we so dependent on they? See, there's something wrong here, and I don't know if they're noticing it. So we're going to watch this video that they have here. They said 46,000 joined from over 102 countries, and they have all these speakers and people, the launch crew. It's interesting. For sure, and again, I am not against the idea of doing demonstrations, right, or forms of representation to try to get the message out of education. But do we have all three? And so we're going to really identify here what's going on and get a closer look as to if this is really going to help us.
Over the last 2 years, millions of us have been protesting and advocating for the restoration of our God-given rights.
Okay.
In every continent and country, we've all been pushing back any way we can. The world has never united under a common cause like this in human history.
It is somewhat a common cause, right? The lack of freedom overall, if that's what it is.
But they have ignored us, dismissed us, and used force and coercion.
And they'll do it
Unelected
again.
bureaucracies like the World Health Organization and the World Economic Forum are trying to centralize and digitize everything. It's time for them to go away.
The future is built by us.
It's time for a global event to send a clear message. We are not exchanging our freedoms for a false sense of security. Do you remember what the world used to be like when we had
freedom to be equal before the law.
Freedom to make your own medical choices.
Freedom to work without mandated medical procedures.
Freedom of speech.
I mean, freedom, we can list literally hundreds of thousands of things that your freedom provides you, because freedom, by definition, is freedom. It allows infinite possibility. You can do anything within freedom. Good or bad. It includes the possibility of the bad. That's what teaches us what is good. You know, and to some extent, we have to embrace that natural chaos that comes with freedom, right? And it's interesting because people say, you know, freedom before the law, as if the law determines people's freedom, man's law. But yet they say they have God-given natural rights. There seems to be a conflict between man's law and natural natural rights. And I don't know if people can even define that concept either. Natural law and natural rights. And then again, you wonder why we are where we are. You know, and saying that, hey, you know, if you look at man's law, it is just opinion of people, right? It's someone's opinion saying this is how I think things should be done. Now, even if you agree with that, you still are imposing your opinion on other people. And what is it backed by? It's backed by violence. And what you're doing with that man's law is essentially limiting other people's freedoms. So freedom is not really freedom when there is the presence of man's law, because by what it does, it always restricts natural freedom, natural law, natural rights.
Freedom from censorship.
The freedom to protest.
Censorship will always probably occur on different platforms depending on their terms of service and how they treat their guidelines. That's why it's important to look at alternative platforms, ones that don't censor you, and that's really the best bet, is just go where you want to go, right?
Freedom of movement.
Freedom of expression.
Freedom of political communication.
Freedom of worship.
Freedom to
just go on forever.
What a different world it is now.
Now you're individuals who are literally going against your oath to fight against peaceful people.
Their oath, more like their own conscience, right? They're not even thinking for themselves. These policemen are just following orders, doing what they're told. They're not even thinking about morality at all.
I love how people talk about personal freedom.
It's time for the governments around the world to hear our voices and leave us alone. We are not their puppets. We are not their test dummies.
I agree with that. But what are we going to do?
We elected them to execute our will, not to enforce tyranny under the guise.
But that is executing other people's wills. That is what you're doing. You say, we elect them to execute and do our will. Okay, well, what are they doing? They're doing the exact same thing just for what they want. That's the very problem with the world, is the world should not be determined by some person's own belief system, some person's own opinion of how they think everything should be ran. Are you God? Are you nature? Do you get to decide how everything works in this world?
Of public health. So, what can we do that they cannot?
Say no to vaccine. I mean, listen, if these signs are educational, I don't see websites in some of these. I think that's part of the issue, right? Protests are very not that efficient, not that effective at what they're trying to actually do, right? Now, this sign over here on the right says the government plus MSM, mainstream media, are lying and manipulating you. So it's saying you, the people out there, right? Maybe it can help give them more ideas as to what's going on, but I think to some extent people do know that, and they just don't know where to go from there. I think most people actually do know there's tyranny going on, and they think they should just go with things, and they make all these attempted excuses and justifications to go with the system, and they feel like they do have no choice. And so it's more so that than anything else, to some extent.
Not ignore. What can we do to bring governments to the negotiating table?
Bring governments to the negotiating table. Yet I thought our governments are we the people and us ourselves. So who is this thing we say is government? Is this some particular people, some particular buildings? I'm a little confused here.
A global walkout and convoy to our capital cities around the world on the same day. They cannot ignore that.
They cannot ignore that. You mean like people, like the people who were like just living their life and they see there's a bunch of people crowding the streets and there's cars driving by? I mean, there is no they, right? The world is made up of people, and some people are deceived, some people are playing the game, and most of the people are playing the game. Most people are just order following and doing what they're told.
We are calling this the global walkout. A walkout from work, from school, and from participating in the tyrannical society they're trying to slow boil us into.
I agree. People should take time away from these things that don't matter as much to fulfill the destiny for humankind, right? They should be able to focus on what really matters, which is creating our freedoms. But is it going to be as simple as just walking outside with a bunch of people and yelling and holding up signs?
To the governments around the world, we have this message for you. Every day, we are living more in knowledge and less in fear. Every day, the number of people willing to say no to you grows. Every day, we become more united, more courageous, and more unstoppable.
I get this is like meant to be like motivational, right, for people, but where is the emphasis on knowledge? If I look at this crowd right now, do I see an emphasis on knowledge? He says we're becoming more knowledgeable, not in fear. Okay, so people are courageous, they're going on the street, they're yelling. Does that mean that they're knowledgeable? Or are they angry? That anger may not be out of knowledge, right? It may be out of, yeah, they're mad, they want their freedoms, but do they actually know how to acquire it? Are there actual requirements in acquiring it? I mean, think about the amount of people that are here. This is so many people. They can organize a community event and really make a difference if they wanted to, but they do not, because they think a protest is the only way to change things, and that is simply wrong.
Stop fighting against them.
You gotta think different if you want a different reality. And how many times have protests and walkouts been used before?
And start working with us.
We are the 99%!
We have experts ready and willing to replace the ones that have led you astray with inaccurate models and fear-based pseudoscience.
We don't want to create more division, right? And we don't want to say like, oh my gosh, you're enslaved, right? Necessarily. We want to educate the people in the dark and really try to find unique solutions and ways of trying to get out of the system or helping people get out of the system. And that can be at a practical individual basis, or it could be at the collective basis of education, right? So that way people can do the individual basis. At the end of the day, the individual needs to heal themselves. They need to free themselves. Mental slavery is the root to all physical slavery.
They will continue to use fear and coercion to manipulate us into complying to things we don't want.
Another they. They will do this. They will do that. So they will, right? These people who proclaim to have power. But who gives them that power, right? And do you have to comply, right? There's many ways you can make a demonstration without just walking on the street.
So why not draw your line in the sand now?
This was the moment when surveillance started going under the skin. Because really we haven't seen anything yet.
For all the information about this global event, go to www.reignitefreedom.com.
Through my studies of different movements, and I've talked about many different movements on my channel, the deal is the same across the board. There's people who are angry and they're mad and they're righteous. They're rightful for being mad and angry, but they just don't know how to treat this anger. And where to put their energy, rather than, exhausting their energy on the streets, where they literally, a lot of problems can happen on the street. I mean, look how crowded this street is, right? With all these people. A lot of problems could happen. You could say, oh, well, that's good for the politicians and the people in government, because then that makes a demonstration to them and what's going on. Again, we shouldn't be dependent upon them in the first place. That's the very issue with our world. If you want to be free, then by definition, you have to take away your dependence on them or any of these people who proclaim to have any special rights that you don't have. But usually it's because you're giving them these special rights through your belief. Our mission is to implement global unified and strategic pushback against the globalist agenda, ensuring we maintain our individual and collective liberty. Okay, where's the education? And where is the symbols or the connected websites that lead people to more education? What is the ripple effect that causes more and more demonstrations being made to where people are no longer paying taxes? I mean, you're literally supporting the government every time you pay them, literally the fruits of your own labor, right? But people don't look at it like that, even though every movement in the past was founded on disobeying that action, because they saw it's connected to the wars, to everything that is imposed upon the population. Everything is based on us and what we give to this system that we created. Not a lot of education here, really just appealing to what people already feel, which is not that bad, but the action is really bland and not enough. Again, protests, walking out, it's not enough to really change things. And so if you're asking me, you're saying, Corey, what is it we need to do? I'm going to link my 4 steps to total freedom video in the description below, because there are 4 steps I think are really important. And there are 3 steps within those 4 steps that need to be utilized in every act of change to make a really big difference, and that is representation, education, and networking. Representation is having a flag or symbol or shared material. It amplifies the voices of the education. It leads to the education. It represents the education. And that's why it's representation. Education, self-explanatory, is what comes from the representation, from the networking. See, what they have is just networking. There's no emphasis on the education or the representation because there is no one symbol or idea that is being pushed out there other than freedom, which still lacks some grounding. What is freedom? How do we define it? How do we achieve it? Well, if you're not talking about natural law or defining slavery through abolitionism and other means of getting the word out there, are you really going to make a difference? There's a reason why I made a very small book so it could be shared and taught to people. What if that was in the streets, shared everywhere, right? That would make quite a difference in the world, perhaps, because it's knowledge that is compact and all together as one that debunks every idea of freedom and causes a conversation about it, not just, here's some people on the street mad and they're there and oh, they're here, they're there, and they're gone the next day and nothing else happens. What you want is a continual conversation about these topics, and that's why the people who have looked into these topics are having that continual conversation and saying, hey, you need to look into natural law. Hey, you need to look into these topics. Because that's how important they realize it is. No one's talking about it. And no one realizes that is the key to getting our freedoms, is understanding those principles, morality in particular, which so many people in the freedom movement will completely leave out. It's all about political action, elections, government, politicians, protests, right? And it's all temporary. It's not long-lasting. It's not unique. It's not what the abolitionists did. It's not what other movements of the past did that made great change. Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. doing civil disobedience and new forms of protest with central messages saying this is what you should do, this is what you should not do. We're not going to pay this tax. We're not going to support this or that, right? It wasn't just protests. Protests were part of the process, but a great deal of it was education. A great deal of it was getting the message out there and having a firm platform and having your own flag. And it's very different, right? The abolitionists were not out there protesting in the streets saying, we got to free the slaves. Make sure you free the slaves. I'm sure some of them were, but for the most part, it was a moral persuasion. It was about arming the slaves themselves, teaching the slaves themselves, teaching the slave owners themselves. They knew those, rich slave owners were not going to listen to the abolitionist demands. So the abolitionists took away from their day-to-day life, their day-to-day job, to do something greater, and they wanted to educate the world. So they made their own newspapers and made their own content. Are you producing your own content? Are you encouraging education? This is what we have to think about, and this is the conversation that needs to get started. It's unfortunate people still think protest is a good means of change, or even elections, for how long it's been done, and how little it ever does in history.